All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Adam Rose. We're at his home in Portland. It's June 3rd, 2024. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
First question, get things started, is why wine?
Yeah, I am looking forward to going through your archives to see other people's answers to that story. I think mine is going to be pretty similar to theirs. I think the vast majority of people, myself included, who find wine like this, either fall into it completely by accident or were born into it in their family. And for me, it was definitely not even close to what I imagined I would be doing. So I'm from Northern California originally, a small town called Chico, which is pretty close to UC Davis. There's a lot of agriculture. It's a mecca of that. I had no intention, in fact, I intentionally wanted to not participate in any sort of that. I think it was kind of a cultural shift for me. I wanted to live in a city. I wanted to experience different things, not be in a small town. So I ended up going to school in LA, and with like a complete rejection of agriculture or wanting to participate in agriculture because I didn't want to be associated with like Hicks or like that kind of a tone of agriculture. So I ended up going to a liberal arts college in Los Angeles, Occidental College, which was fantastic. And I ended up majoring in politics, philosophy, and a minor in classical studies. So absolutely nothing to do with wine. And that was, completely formative. It was the best thing to do. When I graduated that, I had no idea what I wanted to do. A degree in politics, philosophy, and classic studies means you're going into academia or not. And I came out of college with a full understanding that I had no desire to be a part of academia anymore. It was good for me when it was there, but I did not want to pursue that life. And I was the only person in my friend group that didn't. I currently, my close-knit friend group, out of I think the 5 of us, 4 of us have PhDs and are in academia now, and I'm the one who didn't do that. So I didn't really know what I was going to do. Tried to find some different opportunities. One of the things that was really important to me in undergraduate was I worked at a rape and domestic violence crisis center as a crisis counselor. And definitely kind of dove into mental health and from experiences of my own and my own struggles with mental health in college, that became something that was really important to me. And so after college, I was kind of like, okay, what do? I have this experience. It was really great. I, have certifications as a crisis counselor, but I also want to go and make money now that I'm out of college, and what does that look like? So I ended up moving back home, trying to figure out what to do, and then the Standing Rock pipeline protests happened in North Dakota. This is a very roundabout way to get to my story. I ended up, it was October of, 2016, 2017, and it was a little late into the protest, but I was just seeing all these things on social media of the violence that was happening towards Indigenous people there, and I was like, I gotta go. I have the experience to be helpful, so I just sent them an email and was like, hey, I have this experience as a crisis counselor. Let me come and I can maybe be helpful. And I had totally intended to just go for 2 weeks, right? And then go find a real job somewhere. 2 weeks turned into a year, and I lived there for a year. The first part of that year was actually in the protest camp itself. Ended up, because I was pretty much the only one that didn't have obligations at the time, and I was the only one that had the experience to do it, I ended up running a group, heading the mental health department of the Viticulture Council for the Standing Rock pipeline protests, and that was led by Linda Black Elk, who is an ethnobotanist in North Dakota, and she's was the matriarch of that group, and Sarah Jumping Eagle as well, who kind of was more of the medical side of that. But we had every type of discipline there. It was mental health, allopathic medicine, herbal medicine, midwifery, body works, and I lived there and worked there for a year. That came with its own challenges, and it was a very high stress, high pressure environment, because we were kind of having direct face-offs with Army Corps of Engineers, the Sheriff's Department, eventually the Homeland Security came in, and there were conflicts and violence that happened a lot, and it was kind of my job to coordinate volunteers, coordinate medical health professionals to provide mental health for those instances and just for the long-term care of everyone in this population as well. And at its peak, it was 60,000 people living in a city with absolutely no infrastructure, so we had to supply everything. So long story short, that changed my life in a very, very fundamental way. And I had no desire to just kind of reboot and then go back and work for some corporate job somewhere, because before that, that's kind of what I thought I was going to have to do. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And honestly, I had some PTSD coming out of that. Like, it was a struggle to kind of reform back to the world after that experience. I was lucky enough that one of my best friends, who's now getting her PhD at Harvard, was at the time she was going to University of Chicago. And she was just like, hey, I'm moving back to Chicago for the summer. She had just graduated. One of her great friends, who is one of my great friends now, was like a financial consultant for a big firm, and he was being sent to New Zealand for 3 months to go, do the financial consultant life. And so he had a free room, and so I was like, okay, let's do it. I'll move to Chicago for like 3 months just to see. 3 months turned into like 7 or 8 years, just how this goes with me. And I moved to Chicago, drove through, spent some time in the Dakotas. I drove out from Northern California, spent some time in the Dakotas on the way, got to Chicago with like $40 to my name. And I was like, I need a job. And so I printed out a bunch of resumes and I hit the pavement, and I ended up getting 3 jobs at 3 different restaurants. And that's how it works. When you need it and your back's up against the wall, sometimes you just have to get restaurant jobs. And so I was working as a busser at an fine dining Argentinian steakhouse called El Che Bar. I was working at a mezcal bar as a weekend kind of like nighttime cocktail server. And I was working at a brunch place called Johnny's that had been there for 30 years. It was an incredible place. But I did that for a little bit, and then I ended up getting a job at a Polish bakery. And I think for about a year, I only ever had Monday mornings off. I worked a double every day of the week except for Mondays, because the bakery was closed on Monday mornings. And so I got my Monday mornings off. But I think like keeping myself constantly busy like that kind of helped me reset. Also, I was fortunate when those 3 months were up with the room that my friend had. One of my mentors in the mental health field, her name is Marge. She's a member of the Society of Indian Psychologists. She's a Cherokee woman. She's been kind of my mentor in that part of my life. She let me live with her because she was from the suburbs of Chicago, so she had a room and I got to stay there, and that kind of just like allowed me to settle in. But to get back to your question, wine, working at a fine dining Argentinian steakhouse, not having any idea what I was doing. All I knew was how to do what I was asked to do and work pretty hard. And I had a fantastic general manager. His name was Zach, and he was a sommelier. And that was what he did. And it was a pretty intimate, very high quality steak house. I mean, I don't think like white linen tablecloth. It's a little bit more modern than that, but still fantastic food. And every day at like 3:30, 4 o'clock, we would do a real pre-shift meeting. So we would come in, everyone in the restaurant would sit down, one of the cooks would take the opportunity to make family meal, so it would be their chance to cook something and impress the chefs. Zach would bring out several bottles of wine, we would pour them all at the table, and every level was invited to that meeting. And I think that was something that was so important to me at that restaurant was, I was just a busboy. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. I was the only busboy that didn't speak Spanish. I was the only white busboy. Every other position was a Latino person. But I and everyone else sat down on that table and enjoyed the wine with him. And it was just kind of one of those things where once you start doing it, you realize the little things in your past that like hint towards an interest in this hobby. So it all kind of clicked, and I was just like, oh shit. So what I ended up doing was like once a week, I would go to Zach and be like, okay, what are some wines that you think I should really try? Like, what, for educational purposes, like what should I know? And I knew nothing. Like I was an absolute idiot. But that's how everyone starts in wine, and I think that's fantastic. And I think that's a really important lesson that I learned and I've tried to take in this industry, is that you can't be pretentious about wine. You have to meet people where they're at. You have to know that nobody is inherently born with the knowledge of like what grape is in Barolo or where even that is. You have to put in a lot of work and effort to get there. And so it's not worth being a snob about it. But yeah, I worked there for a little while. It was fantastic. I learned just enough to know that I was really interested, but not enough to really mean anything. And then eventually, those kind of jobs come and go. I think I got some better opportunities elsewhere. I was still at El Che Bar a little bit. And then I got a serving job working at a cocktail bar called Gideon Sweet, which only lasted for about a year. I forget his name, but it was a celebrity chef's restaurant. We never saw him. He was there maybe twice because it was like he had a contract with the city where if he didn't build another restaurant in the space, he would lose the space. So he did, and it was a shit show. It was horrible. And there wasn't enough wine for me. And so I worked there for a little bit, and then finally Zach, that mentor, my first mentor in wine, reached out to me and said, hey, I got an opportunity. I'm going to be just the wine director at this new concept that this fantastic restaurant group is opening. Do you want to come with me? I can give you a serving position. And so I interviewed with a man named Josh Tillman, who was a restaurateur in Chicago at the time, and Erling, who worked for Paul Kahn, who was a Michelin star chef. And so I ended up getting in on the ground floor of that restaurant. It was called Pacific Standard Time, and it was all about kind of just like a fresh West Coast kind of concept, fusion of foods, but with a high focus on West Coast wines. Mm-hmm. And that opportunity kind of jump-started the reality of my wine career. I did that for a little while, then I remember I had distinct memories of early on in my liberal arts career watching that movie Somm with the Court of Master Sommeliers and being like, oh, those people are nuts. Fun movie, done, right? But it's like one of those hindsight moments where you're like, oh, interesting, because I watched that so early in my college career, thought it was interesting, and then moved on. And then at Pacific Standard Time, I was encouraged to take my first level, just the intro level. And it was paid for by the restaurant, which was fantastic. So I did, studied like absolutely crazy, way more than I needed to, passed it, and then immediately signed up and took the second level and passed that within the next month. The second level was maybe a bit of a reach for me though, that being that young in the industry. My partner is upstairs doing work. It was a very funny experience when I first signed up for that. I was like, okay, here's what this is going to entail. This is about, I only have a month to study for this. So I'm going to cram. I'm not going to leave my room. I'm going to go to work. I'm going to come back. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to study. And I was a very good student in college. I really love studying. I can do it really well if I have to. But I basically didn't leave that house for a month. And I'm also a very high anxiety person in general, so I brought a lot of anxiety to that process. And then I asked him afterwards, and he was just like, would you let me do that again, now knowing the entire process? Absolutely not. So it was a big process, but I passed my certified Somm exam. And that was, I don't know, early 2017, 2018, I believe. And so by then, I knew that wine was my path. It was clear that was going to be the direction I was going, but I didn't really know what direction still. Like if you asked me at that moment what I wanted to do long term, I wouldn't be able to tell you. It was just kind of like fumbling around in the dark and then finding things that excited you and kind of clinging on to them. And I think most of the people my generation in the wine industry, at least here in Oregon, that I've talked to and shared my story with and now work with really closely, have that story too, of just like, we didn't actually know it all, but here we are.
When you first encountered wine, I'm curious what your kind of initial reaction to it was. Obviously, you'd seen Somm, you'd grown up in an ag town, you had some familiarity that wine existed. When you got to the sort of the fine dining part of your life, tell me about. Were you excited to learn about wine? Were you trepidatious about wine? What was your kind of initial impression to fine wine?
Yeah, I think, it would be hard not to be a little scared by it, because here I am kind of like not really a country boy because I never really felt that, but I'm from Chico, California. It's not that big of a town. My family grew up relatively poor. We had no access to fine dining. We had no access to fancy wine. I always thought growing up that my mom was a wino, but really she just liked, a bottle of Bogles in on the counter for a little. And that was pretty much my experience of wine growing up. So I had no context for this world. It was completely foreign to me. And then the agriculture world that I grew up in, I did not really associate agriculture with fine dining at all. Agriculture to me was my grandparents are from a pretty rural town in northern Nevada, Lovelock, Nevada, and they're cattle ranchers, and you pull up and the whole town smells like cow. And so that was my impression of agriculture, not having anything to do with this concept of viticulture or, quality or farm to table, anything that I get excited about now. So when I went into it, it was a totally alien experience, but I think I'm somebody that kind of thrives getting thrown into those, where it did cause me a lot of trepidation, but it was also kind of a new challenge, and something that I could feel proud of, because I think that's something that drives me, is if I'm going to do something, I need to be good at it. Otherwise, I have no interest in doing it, and that's just a motivator. So when I first went into that, I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the network to understand how do I learn about this thing, how do I try to get better at it, and that's why that mentor was so important, right? Because even though he took a little bit of a passive role, it wasn't like we were having meetings every day individually or once a week. It was just he provided a platform and then was willing to answer questions and point me in the direction, and then eventually give me the job opportunity that really made it take off. But it was nerve-wracking, but super exciting when I got into it. When you catch the wine bug, you really catch it hard, and it takes over.
Tell me about the education process for you then. Obviously a lot to learn in a pretty short amount of time. You mentioned being a good student, being able to kind of learn quickly. What were the kind of the methods you took for learning, and what did you find interesting as you were in the process of learning all of this so quickly? What was it that kept you interested?
I think for wine at that moment, and still to now, the thing that on the academic side that fascinates me is the complexity of it. In college I was a double major, I had a minor, I was really motivated, I was in all kinds of clubs, I really wanted to dive deep. You two were talking about Greek mythology earlier, and I tried not to jump in that conversation because I could talk to you for an hour. I wrote a thesis paper on what you were talking about. So I like that kind of mode of thinking. And also I wanted to feel accomplished, right? I surround myself with friends who are very academically achieved, and I like to feel at the same level. I like to feel that way, even though that's maybe silly or a toxic trait in some ways. And so when you approach wine, it is kind of one of those things that no matter how much you learn, even if you're a master somm, I have worked with so many master somms, there is so much they have to learn, right? And that's what fascinated me, is just this, I'm never gonna be done. It's gonna be something that I can just keep diving into. And I needed, when I first started it in Chicago, when I passed those first 2 exams, I was feeling like I just needed to get a baseline. I needed my basics to be covered, because at that point, if you'd asked me what Sauvignon Blanc was, I might be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And you need to know the baseline before you can really dive into the complexities. And so that was what really motivated me to do that. In terms of how I studied, or my process, I was living in a tiny apartment in Chicago with a roommate. This was pre-COVID. I was still with Austin, my partner, and what we would do is I had a study buddy, somebody I met through my roommate, because at the time my roommate was teaching at a French international school, and a co-worker at the French international school is one of the somms for Alinea. Alinea is the 3 Michelin star restaurant in Chicago, one of the best restaurants in the world, and they go through somms like nobody else, because it's a job that you work for a few months or a year to get it on your resume, and then you move on, so you can get paid the proper amount somewhere else. And so I was working with him, and he recommended me the study buddy who worked at a hotel. And that was really important, to have somebody with me to keep me motivated, but also to kind of bounce things off of. And he knew way more than me at the time. Like, I tried to hold my own in terms of knowledge, but he would just say things, and I'd just be like, I have no idea what he's talking about. And that both causes anxiety in those kind of moments, but also motivates you to try to go in and look that up and be able to hold that conversation. I also kind of think that a lot of my personal philosophy around wine comes from those moments, because I never want to make somebody that I'm working with feel stupid. Whereas in a lot of the periods where I was learning, I was made to feel stupid. And for me, that was a motivator, but I don't like that if I'm going to talk to somebody or mentor somebody. And I think that's a huge problem with our industry. So we would meet once a week. I got every wine book I could get my hands on. I created this Google Docs folder, and we would have a folder for every country, subfolders for every region, and then subfolders for every sub-region. And we would have Excel sheets and spreadsheet and Google Docs. And the Google Docs were reading through every wine book we could about that sub-region, and then listing summaries of it, just like a Spark Notes, like this is what this chapter was. But then we'd consolidate all of them, so it was like a master guide for that sub-region, talking about climate, culture, soil, varietal, winemaking practices, legal, like all of that for every sub-region of every region of every wine region in the world. And we did that. Still to this day, I have that document still to this day, and I looked at it because I gave it to my friend who was trying to think about doing his first level, and he was just like, this is insanity, I'm never going to do that. And I was like, okay, yeah, we probably went a little too hard, but that's the way I like to study. I don't like to go I don't like to feel unprepared. So we did that. And this is the exam that was the first one that you have to do the tasting. You have to do a service exam, and then you have to do your theory exam. So that was theory, and I felt very confident. I have a fun picture that my partner really likes to show of me sitting on the couch, and I have a giant wine book. I have a wine book inside of that wine book, and I have another wine book next to me. And those are pretty much, like, that's how I lived for a month doing that process. So theory is something that I was always confident about, because I can just brute force that studying. Service is a little bit more up in the air. Luckily, mentorship is a huge part of that, right? So Zach, who is now the wine director at the restaurant that I was working at, we would do mock services at the restaurant I worked at. So not only was I walking around with a little notebook trying to memorize every village in Burgundy and be able to tell you from like north to south and south to north while I was working, I would change the way that I did my service to be the way that the exams were. Because, we were fine dining. We were like fine dining-ish, this restaurant. It was upscale casual, I would say. So we were not necessarily following the protocols that we needed to pass this exam. But I would try to just do it anyway, just to get a feel for it. And it was just a sparkling wine service. Looking back now, I could pass that exam sleeping, right? But at the moment when I was so young in the wine world, it was so intimidating to me. And rightfully so, because I was young enough that I didn't have the experience to really be confident about what I was doing. Now I do. So we did that, and then for the tasting portion, Austin or my roommate Joe, I went out and bought. They give you a list of like fair game wines, right? So you know exactly what is fair game for this blind tasting. And I bought at least one example, hopefully two, of every one on that list. Cost a ridiculous amount of money. And I bought a Corvin, which is a device that, that has a needle and you can get a glass of wine out. So that way, instead of just opening a bottle and using it once and tasting it, I could Corvin them. And so over that month, I was poured 3 reds and 3 whites every morning and every night. And it was the first thing I did and the last thing I did. Exactly. I'm a little crazy. Like I can't, and that's how I approach exams. Mm-hmm. That's how if I set a deadline for myself, that is the level of intensity that I bring to things. And so that is why, Austin was like, no, we're not doing that again. And when we get into this, I think that same level of intensity is what I brought to then eventually starting a small vineyard project as well. And it's been a full bore ever since then. But that's kind of the way that I started with wine. And then since then, I kind of coasted after that for a while, right? Like it was like, okay, I passed this, I get to just relax and live my life a little bit. I was traveling, I went to Austria, did some wine things there, went to northern Italy, did some wine things there. That was fantastic. And it wasn't until like 2+ years later that I even had the idea to take my next level or continue that education. Because I think my focus shifted a little bit. The real like Oregon's journey started after working at Pacific Standard Time for so long. I got the opportunity to apply to be the sommelier there. And I applied and I had an amazing interview, but I didn't get the job. A coworker did. And that was hard for me because I am very competitive. It was also the best thing that could have happened because if I had gotten that job, I would not be in Oregon today. And it was a motivator, being like, okay, I'm still kind of serving, somming, half, like doing both on the floor right now. I don't want to keep doing that. What do I do next? And not getting that job was like, okay, well, I'm not doing that. So what am I doing? And a thing you do in the wine world when you're working in wine is you work a harvest. You got to go learn harvest. And so I was like, okay, this is my year for harvest. Because I'd done the exams, I'd done the theory, I'd done the studying, but the part that I didn't really know is winemaking, or like how to touch it with your hands and put reality to something that is in a book. And so I just started applying, and I applied to like 45 wineries. I knew that I wanted to work somewhere of quality, and I wanted to work somewhere relatively small, not big bulk winery. But I had no real caveats of where or what style. I was really open. I had my personal preferences of style at that point, obviously, but I didn't really know what I would be able to get because it was my first harvest. And I ended up applying to a lot. Got a few offers back, but one of the offers was here in Oregon at Trisatum. Is the winery, and did an interview with them over Zoom in my tiny little kitchen, where I was also leading wine classes at the time through Zoom, because this was still pre-COVID. But yeah, I accepted that job and came out to Oregon for the first time.
So that was 2019?
19. I did my first vintage in 19. Yeah.
What was your familiarity with Oregon wine at that point?
So a little bit, like a tiny bit, because I got lucky. Chicago is a mecca. We're an A market, so we get anything we want. And so a lot of Oregon wine ends up in Chicago. And I was working at a restaurant that was West Coast focused. So we had some representation of Oregon wine. The wine list I was working on kind of flirted with the natural wine as well. So Chad Stock from Minimus was a huge purveyor at the restaurant. Kelly Fox was probably one of our most popular Pinot Noirs, the Mirabai, at the restaurant that I worked at. So we definitely got an exposure to Oregon wine through this restaurant. So I knew that it was a quality industry. I knew there were amazing people that I wanted to meet and wanted to know. But the same would be said of California too, right? Like we had the Jolie Lade wines, which are fantastic. Those folks came over. A lot of small producers, and the more kind of like flirting with natural, but a little bit more quality was kind of the style. And I didn't really understand what that meant at the time. I still think a lot of people don't, but it was there. The exposure was there, but I couldn't tell you what sub-AVAs of Oregon were. I knew they existed, but I couldn't tell you.
So tell me about that experience. Tell me about coming to Oregon and working at Harvest.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I got very lucky. This will be a theme later too. So one of my best friends, her name is Azure. We grew up together. She is now finished her PhD at Berkeley in neuroscience and is working for some like biotech startups and doing that kind of thing. But her family also grew up in Chico, but they have Oregon roots. And at the time, her mom and dad were living in Salem. So when I got this job, I didn't know where Trisatum was. I didn't know who the people at Trisatum were. I didn't know where I was going to live. And they were just like, oh, come stay with us in Salem. It's only like a 45-minute drive up to, the winery, which is like Newburgh, McMinnville kind of esque area. And And so I came out like 2 weeks earlier. I drove across the country with my roommate, did like a 3-week trip through Canada, and like we made it an event. And then got out here, and we did a little orientation meeting in their office upstairs. And James Fry, who is the winemaker and owner of Trusadum, and Justin, who is their cellar master and still is their assistant winemaker now, were leading that meeting. And I have literally no idea what I was getting into, but the meeting kind of went like, okay, here are our expectations of everyone. Just show up, work hard, this, and then here's what we're going to give you. And when they talked about this as, look, we don't want you doing one job all of harvest. This is about education. Like, you're giving us your time for not a lot of pay. We want you to walk out of this experience feeling like you learned and you got to touch everything. And so immediately when I had the meeting, I was like, okay, cool. Like, that's exactly what I wanted. I was really worried because I had heard stories from friends and coworkers that I was going to land somewhere that made me scrub barrels the whole time. And it's like, fine, I'll scrub it. Like, I'm not averse to hard work, but I also really wanted to learn. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that they took that to heart very seriously. Like, James is now my biggest mentor in the wine world. And I learned most of what I know working there. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. Yeah, I kind of want to go through my photos of the 19 experience, because 19 was a cooler harvest. So we probably just showed up. I knew nothing. I think everyone there was fresh. I have the photo, the bottom photo up there on the wall is my crew from that first year. It was all boys, which they got a lot of shit for. But I remember having an experience. No fruit had been picked yet. We were in the barrel room, moving barrels out to the patio. And what we would do is we'd rinse them. We'd do a cold water rinse. We would get a steamer. We'd steam them, and then we'd fill them with ozone. And it was a super repetitive process. It was that, and it was pressure washing all the bins. So they own all their own bins. They're stored on this driveway right under an oak tree, and the oak tree just drops all kind of debris on the bins all year long. And they only use them for a month or two. And so we had to pressure wash them. It was super repetitive and super just grunt work. And I remember doing that work, and then like a lightning bolt struck me. It was one of the biggest career aha moments of my entire life, being like, I haven't even started this yet, and I know that already that this is what I want to do. Like, I don't want to be in a restaurant. I don't want to be selling people wine in a dining setting. I like selling people wine, but not in a dining setting. This is what I want to do. I want to work with my hands. I want to get back into production. And honestly, it was the biggest aha moment. And that was early vintage in 2019. And that vintage just got better for me from there. It was a long commute, but we'd drive up. We would take rotations of folks to work lab work. So once we got fruit picked in and brought in early in the morning, it would be one person would get there super, super early, get in the lab, take readings from all the different fermentations, pull samples, set up a tasting, and then every intern, James and Justin, the first thing we'd do every morning is we would sit down 7:30, 8 in the morning in the lab, and we'd go through every fermentation and we would taste it together, and we'd talk about, where is this at? What's going on with this? What do you think we need to do with this? And then we would come to an agreement as a group, which is something that a lot of wineries do not do. As a first-year intern who's never touched a wine production process, by the end of that process, I was talking to him about, I think we need to drain and press this. I think it needs to, we need to do some more aggressive pump overs. We need to not. What does that mean? Let's look at how reduced this is. What do we do about this reduction? How are we gonna, and I like solving problems. So it just became this huge puzzle piece of massive logistics going on in the winery, but also talking about individual fermentations, and then being given these tools that you do X, this is what happens to that. It became a really fun puzzle for me. I also really like to use my hands, and I'm pretty handy, so I fixed a lot of things at the winery for them. It was a great experience. I quite loved it.
So coming out of that, after having that kind of lightning bolt moment,
Yeah.
what did you see as your next step? What did you see as a goal, I guess?
You know, honestly, I think that first few months of having that, I didn't really think much past the moment because I was really just having fun. It was incredible, and I knew that I discovered what I wanted to do, and that was like good enough. The planning portion of like, okay, well, what does this mean, was a challenge after that, because I kind of fell into a thought process of like, look, this is what I want. I want to have a vineyard. I want to be able to produce. I want to do this. I'm never going to be able to do that. Just the reality, right? Like, I don't have family money. I don't have land. I don't have connections. I was like, I'm not going to be able to do that. It's not a possibility. And so that part was actually rather unfortunate. And like, I don't want to say I fell into a slump, but I think I did a little bit post-vintage, right? And I think that's the experience with a lot, like you're about to graduate. I think that's an experience. It's like post something that's so important in your life, there's a lot of unknowns that come with that. It's a scary journey, but it's one of the most exciting journeys. It really is. So I didn't really know what to do. At the same time, I got lucky. I got lucky, and it's something that I will always be grateful for. We didn't know how serious this was at the time, but I was trying to figure out how to make this a reality, because I'm somebody who just wants to make something a reality. When I want it, I just do it. And honestly, it was seeing the vineyards that James had, because he has 3 properties. 2 of them are truly his, and one his friend owns, and then he farms, and it's still his estate fruit, but it's not full ownership. He has one in the Coast Range Mountains, and going out to his property in the Coast Range Mountains is stunning. It's a skinny little driveway up the mountain and these giant rolling hills of vineyards. Very steep, super steep in the context of Oregon vineyards, and also very west, so it was super more mountainous and lush, and I love that. I was like, how do I make this happen? There's no way to. And then I remembered I'm living with these 2 people, Rick and Josie Grant, the parents of my like best friend growing up. You know, the house growing up was just always open. I would always just kind of bounce between our friend groups. We did bike rides, we would make cocktails without her parents knowing in high school, right? They were like second parents to me. They had property in Oregon that I'd never been to. I'd only heard rumors of it. They just called it their ranch. And you know, I think I texted my friend Azure one day, just kind of like joking, being like, oh, like, what if we planted grapes at your ranch? Like, I want to plant grapes at your ranch. And it was just kind of a joke. And she's, you know, at Berkeley getting her PhD and doing other things. And I'm living with her parents. And when I was living with her parents, they were like, yeah, let's just drive out there. You know, let's just drive out there. And drove out some point in 2019. I think it was towards the end of harvest, you know, at the beginning of kind of this funk period, and it didn't solve the funk at all, let me tell you. It was more just like, crazy fun ideas. But we drove out to this property, which is a 600-acre property, just a little under 600 acres, but it's 600 acres in Harlan, Oregon, which is kind of halfway in between Newport and Corvallis. So way the fuck out in the middle of nowhere, way out there. And, you know, unfortunately, in my eyes, they had, I think, a year and a half to 2 years before we went out there, ended up clear cutting a considerable amount of the property. They had just inherited it from their father who had passed away. And before that, it hadn't really been managed. I think it had been decades and decades since anything had been done with this land. And, you know, coming into that kind of a land with that value of timber on it, it was kind of they had to clear it. And they did. And it was kind of one of those moments for them where this has always been such an important part of their family, been in their family for 5 generations. You know, Rick is getting up there. I tease him, he call him an old man. But his grandfather or great-grandfather, I cannot remember which one, fenced the entire 600 acres by hand with a horse cutting down the logs to build the fences. So it is a labor of love for them, this property. And seeing the amount of destruction that a clear cut caused was kind of a moment. And so when I went out there with them, it was just like somber. exciting, beautiful. Like the property, it's like I got excited and I was like, this is incredible. But it was, they had only seen it a few times, and it was like clear that it wasn't the future that they wanted to have for their property. Which is kind of how I was able to start proposing that wine might be an alternative or might be a solution to this, both economically and environmentally. But, we were so far out, so far west, we had no idea what we were doing. It was just kind of a, let's visit, let's show you the property. But I immediately fell in love with the property. I really did. It was, the elevation ranges from high 200s down at the valley where the house is, and then you go take a back road up, and the mountain kind of starts creeping up, and you creep up all the way to the main kind of area, I'd say, is between 400 and 700. And then there's a road up that cuts through a little notch that the state owns, and then you go up to what they call Baldy, which is the very, very top mountain of their property, and that's around 1,200 feet elevation. So the elevation changes are pretty extensive, and the hillsides that were cut were these beautiful south-southwest facing slopes, probably like 30% incline, which in the wine world is kind of great, and I was coming out of working with James and seeing those vines at the Coast Range Mountains and seeing how steep the Coast Range Mountains are. And I was like, this is doable. Let's do this. This is incredible, because I wanted to make it work. So I talked to James about it, right? That was the first route. I was like, James, look, harebrained scheme, crazy idea. This is what they're talking about. Like, let's just assume that we could afford to do it. Let's just assume that there aren't actually hurdles. What would this take? And James told me this whole story. He told me this story about he's living in LA, and when he first bought his property, he didn't even see it. He pulled it up on Google Earth. And so we sat in the lab at Trisadum, and he pulled up his computer and pulled up the land on Google Earth, did the topography, saw how steep everything was, looked at how west it was, and was just like, oh yeah, you should do this. Like, yes, absolutely do this. Looking back at that, I'm so happy that he said that, because everyone else that I've encountered maybe would not have been that enthusiastic about this harebrained scheme. But that encouragement is pretty much all it took for me. And so then it became, okay, well, what does this mean? And we still didn't know. And James, again, was kind of the guiding force there. He was like, look, before you do anything crazy, talk to this guy, Andy Gallagher, figure out what he thinks, go from there. Like, don't get ahead of yourself. So called Andy Gallagher, and he's obviously the soil scientist who knows everything about everything here in the Oregon wine world. Set a date for him. I think it was a month or so after harvest, maybe not quite that long. But I was, I had essentially taken a leave of absence from my job in Chicago to do harvest. So I was not under any kind of time constraint to get this done. So Andy Gallagher graciously agreed to kind of rush a soil test of our site for us before I had to leave. And so he came out. Fortunately, so my business partners are Bob and Rick. Rick is the father of my best friend, Asher, and he introduced me to his brother, Bob, who lives on the property full time. Bob built his own house on this property. It is a wild, wild place. But they have an excavator that they own that lives there. So Bob rolled around on this excavator, and Andy, we dug like 16 test pits all over the property, various depths. Andy did soil analysis, sent soil mapping to the labs, did the whole 9 yards, sent us a fantastic report months later. Very encouraging. And I actually think that I might be getting the time frames mixed up. I think I left in 2019, and I think, yeah, okay, I'm wrong. Because I remember very specifically Andy not wanting to ride in the mule with us because of COVID. Mm-hmm. So I must have left Oregon having just seen the property, having talked to James, and then I went back to Chicago. That is what happened. Because then I was like, okay, nothing happened. Like, it was just a fun weekend, daydream kind of a thing. And James was very encouraging. But then I went to my normal life in Chicago for 2020. That's exactly what happened. Okay. So I knew who Andy was, but I don't think he was able to get it. And that's exactly what it was. So let's just say I went back to Chicago. I ended up not going back to that restaurant because I took so much time off that it was kind of just like well, you guys have kind of gotten things buttoned down here. Let me go figure out what else I can do. And I ended up getting a job at a wine retail store in northern Chicago called Vin Chicago. And I ended up kind of unofficially managing that location, if you know what that means. If Mike Baker ever watches this, he'll know what that means. No, I ended up, I landed there, and I believe, the timelines are so hard, honestly, because I would have gone back from Oregon close to winter. And then I think I was unemployed for quite a long time because I was doing other projects. And then I think I went back to see my family, and I maybe did some traveling in between. That's what it was. And then we were moving. So there were a lot of moving pieces in life. Like, life just happens, and it just goes forward. And I was in a position where I had saved enough money working at the restaurant that I could just kind of roll with life a little bit, although it was stressful. And then I ended up getting this job because I was like, okay, it's time to go back to a real job. And that was maybe just a few months before the pandemic. I think it was like January of 2020, and what pandemic was March. So I worked there for a few months, and then the pandemic hit. And that was like its own wild experience of working in wine retail during a pandemic. But to kind of wrap up like the Vineyard story in that part of it, at that point of life, I think it was just like, okay, that was a fun experience. I want to work harvest again. That was the big takeaways. I'm going to do another harvest. And that was my main like stress that whole year, was securing somebody to take me back for harvest. It wasn't, okay, here's the vineyard or here's the property. Although I had that amazing experience with them. It was just kind of like something that we moved on from.
Well, before we get back to Oregon, let's talk a little bit about the pandemic, because an interesting time to be doing anything. So tell us about your pandemic memories.
Yeah. So I hadn't been working there for very long, but the company that I was working for is called Vin Chicago. It's a family-run wine retailer. Peter Schwarzbach, I believe, was the third generation owner of this. Kind of the heritage of alcohol sales in Chicago are very interesting, and there's like several family histories that are kind of intertwined with that. And his is one of like main 3 Jewish families that always had a hand in alcohol sales. And so I was in Highland Park, which is a northern suburb, at his store, and it was fairly, I don't want to say fairly small, no. For Chicago, it was fairly small. It was probably 4 or 5 times as big as any wine store I've ever been in here in Oregon. And it's different in Oregon. There's a lot more restrictions of the way that you buy from distributors. The OLCC is very different. Chicago is a little bit more of a wheeling and dealing kind of a place. And so there was a lot of that, right? Like, the only main rule that kind of restricted us is that if you're a retail store in Chicago, you weren't allowed to have your own warehouse, or a separate warehouse off-site. Peter got away with that by building his storefronts into warehouses that already existed. So our model was always, no matter what wine we sold, they wanted to be the least expensive wine, price of that wine in the country. And they were, through very aggressive negotiations and dealings. And I definitely learned a lot of sales tactics and distribution tactics and marketing from working there. So it was a really important thing that I did very intentionally, being like, okay, here, I've been in the restaurant world. I've kind of now gotten my toe wet in the production world. I need to see the sales world of this on a larger scale, because you kind of need everything to be a little bit successful in this world, in this industry, I mean. So the pandemic comes along, and we have the fortunate thing about that was they had a website. And the website was hand-built, completely broken, never worked. It was horrible. And the fulfillment was just, and they'll all agree with me, it worked, but it wasn't the way it needed to be. And overnight, we saw, 1,000-fold increase of traffic on that website. We were very lucky for the first week of the pandemic. We all thought we were not going to have jobs again, right? And lots of people in my industry didn't. But at the very last minute, the governor of Illinois declared like wine shops and alcohol stores as what was the word? Essential workers.
Essential workers.
Yeah, that was the word. Essential workers. And because they wanted the tax revenue. They didn't want to get the tax revenue up, and they're like, oh shit, we got to keep these open. Plus, people would have been very, very upset. So we went very quickly to a model where we locked the front doors. We had several phones. We called it the bat phone. It was a little flip phone, and I still to this day have memories of that ringtone. Like it will haunt me for the rest of my life. And we were a skeleton crew at the time. It was me and my manager, Mike Baker, and he was the wine buyer for our whole chain. So we had 2 other locations. So he was doing like 10 million things. And while he was really the manager of that store, he kind of put the store managerial duties on me at the time because I was competent and I worked really hard. But we were pulling 10, 11, 12, 13-hour days at that wine store at the time. And it's like, this is a little retail job. I didn't sign up for that. It was just, we're doing it anyway. But people would pull up. They would either have ordered online or they wanted to order. And we're talking like moneyed northern suburb of Chicago. So if you think about white Karens who really want their wine middle of a pandemic, like it was a challenge. They would call the store, they would either need their wine to be picked up from our like will call system. So we had a separate warehouse with folders. Like it was you're archive people. You know how it goes. It was an archive of wine that went back like a decade because some people would just serially buy and never pick it up. So we had hundreds and hundreds and thousands of bottles that were just already paid for and no one would pick it up. And we'd have to sort through all of that to bring out wine. I remember a gentleman gave me his credit card through the little door slot and just said, I want $5,000. Bottles $20 and under. And so that took me a good hour to put together because at that point he didn't know if we were going to be open the next day, right? Because that was the idea. It's like we're going into a global pandemic. Nobody knew what the future was going to be. And so that was it blew up. We were up so much that year, where every other part of our industry really suffered. We exploded, and we kept our distributor partners alive too, because overnight on-premise sales disappeared, and so off-premise became so important to them. And I was taking home maybe a case of wine a week as just sample bottles that they were trying to get us to buy. And so, like, the entire under part of that staircase is filled with cases of wine that I got for free during that pandemic period. And yeah, I took one to the coast yesterday, and we had a nice bottle. It was a Chianti, and I was just like, oh, yeah, this came from Vin Chicago at some point. But it was absolute madness, and it was trial by fire for me. Whereas I really thought that I had a good knowledge base, having taken these SOM exams, having worked in the restaurant for several years, being exposed to different wines, and then you realize or at least I realized when I went into this retail setting, that my knowledge was very focused, and it needed to broaden a little bit, because instead of focusing on the 150 wines and really getting to know these producers and like talking about I was all of a sudden I had $600,000 to $1 million worth of inventory at one time I was in charge of managing. And so my breadth of knowledge had to expand very quickly. And that was constant. We were tasting every single day. We were having, we were trying to make our lives acceptable. But at the same time, it was a major logistics challenge. So I was essentially a logistics coordinator. Like I had to reorganize their warehouse. I had to come up with new cataloging systems. I had to their computer system. I was running inventory for them when they did inventories, figuring out, okay, how do we count for all the errors? When you almost double your volume, you're gonna go through a lot of errors. So it was a lot of that, and it was an amazing learning experience, and I don't regret it looking back. I would never do it again, never, but I don't regret it. And part of that process led me because they knew what I wanted. They knew that I was going into harvest. And when COVID not died down, but like became a little bit more acceptable, I was like, am I going to be able to go anywhere? I don't know. At the time, my goal was really to go to Europe. I was like, okay, I did Oregon. That was great. I want to go to Europe. And I was actually in conversations with a few different people. So GD Vira from Barolo, I was like, oh, I'd love to go to Barolo. I mean, James's style definitely influenced me, right? I mean, we haven't really talked about my personal wine preferences, but I intentionally chose James and Tresadum because they made Riesling, because they made sparkling wine, and because their Pinot Noirs were Oregon Pinot Noirs, being lighter bodied and higher acid and more complex than just like jammed fruit and high alcohol. And those are what I was looking for. Obviously, Barolo is not 100% fit that category, but this producer also made Riesling, and they were the first people to make Riesling in Barolo, and their style is really cool, and I got to visit them and I fell in love with them, so I was like, oh, I want to work with you. But I was also talking to Dunhoff in Germany, Nahe, and that was the most promising. That was like actually going to happen. And then, of course, the pandemic didn't calm down like we all thought it was going to, and there was no chance of me getting a tourist visa or let alone a work visa to go to Europe. And so I was like, damn, this sucks. I'm definitely just a shit out of luck 2020, right? Like a lot of people were shit out of luck. So I ended up just texting James being like, hey, hope things are well. COVID is not lending me towards finding anything. Do you know anybody in the Valley? And he just responded, I don't know if he called me or shot me an email, but he responded very quickly and was just like, hey, if you're struggling to find a place, come back, work for me again for a second year. Like, we'll give you a supervisor position in the winery and we'd love to have you back. So then it was like, okay, great. I knew what I was getting into. 2020 crisis averted, or so I thought. But I ended up coming back and working for Tresadum in 2020. Still working at the wine store. I just took a leave of absence from that, and then came back to that afterwards.
And then got here to see what this 2020 harvest looked like.
See what 2020 harvest looked like, which was a fantastic experience to have gone through, I guess.
Tell me about 2020.
Yeah, so 2020 was obviously rough. Coming off of 2019 especially, because 2019, vintages of 2019 in Oregon, we didn't really talk about that vintage or what that was like, but like, I love it. It's one of the vintages I will look for always. A little bit of rain, a little cooler, more of a classic Oregon vintage. The wines are phenomenal. 2020 comes around, warmer year. COVID is happening. I ended up not being able to live with the people I lived with last time because they had moved out to Bend. And I was like, well, shit, who am I going to live with? And that was one of the things that Tresadum is maybe lacking, and is they don't have any housing for their interns. It's like, it's COVID. Like, where am I going to find a place to stay? And Alice, who is kind of one of the lead tasting room folks for Tresadum, graciously allowed me to live in her guest bedroom in the middle of a pandemic. And on top of that, she also let Austin come. I think he was working for a university in Illinois at the time, and so he had just generous amounts of time off. So he spent like 3 weeks with me at the beginning, came in the middle, spent 3 weeks, and then in the end. And Alice let us do that, even though it was very stressful for everyone because we were really worried about COVID at the time. But I got to the winery, and it was a totally different experience. The same in terms of the logistics, and you go through the motions of making the wine, and we learn it, but none of the interns were allowed in the lab. We were sectioned off from the front of house folks, so we couldn't have these beautiful dinner or lunches that we had done the year before. Every lunch we sat down, the entire team, and we would blind taste wines together, and we'd have wine every single lunch. Couldn't do that. It sucked. And then, of course, the fires happened. And I, have a fantastic, I should send you some of these things that we talk about. But I have a video. One of the things that he really wanted to make happen, even though it was COVID, was he's a big, final, the football thing where you do your pick.
Fantasy football.
Thank you. Fantasy football. Obviously, it's not my thing. But even though I played football in college, and I played high school and college football, but I'm not... he really wanted to do their draft pick for it. And it was a big event that he did every year. So we were outside. The fires had maybe just broke out. Everyone was really anxious about them. We didn't really know what it meant or if it was going to be a problem or not. And I set my phone on the tables because we had this big U shape, and he has a cold room that he lets all of his fruit stay in. And we were just taking chalk and like doing the football. Thank you. The football picks on the door. And I set my phone and I did a time lapse of these clouds because it was like clouds. And then all of a sudden it was these apocalyptic rolling like nightmare clouds that you're like, is that even cloud or what is that? Working at Trisatum, I got so fortunate through that vintage because they still made wine. We were tasting wine every day, right? Like we picked everything, and his philosophy was he doesn't have crop insurance. He's a small grower. And so it wouldn't make financial sense for him to invest in crop insurance when he had the option to potentially just self-insure. And so it was, and they were doing okay with it. They could kind of do that. And he's an insurance guy. That's where he came from. So he knew what he was doing. But he had no incentive. What I'm trying to say is he had no incentive to leave his fruit. So we picked it just like normal. The first bits, we got some whites in. They were totally fine, or so we thought. And then the smoke kind of hit. Because the experience on Ribbon Ridge that we had was these apocalyptic clouds. And you can see it's very stratified. So it's crisp, clean air on the bottom. And these apocalyptic rolling clouds kind of hit the ridge and bounced up. And where the Trisatum vineyards are, it's on that kind of slope of the ridge. And so when you have the fire, it didn't settle in the vineyard very quickly, if at all, until about a week later. And then everything settled. And yeah, I have some really interesting videos of driving to my harvest job from my, from the house. I just set my phone on the dashboard and drove, and you can barely see 2 or 3 feet in front of you. It was horrible. Let alone you have us and then the vineyard crew and the laborers who are picking out in that, physically picking fruit, all of them wearing like massive respirators. And that was a huge concern for James and the team there, is like, how do we do this in a way that isn't gonna harm people? Because I remember dragging a fruit bin, driving the forklift to the edge of the pavement, dropping it, and dragging the fruit bin through the smoke to set it at the end of the row. Because we were just like trying to find some things to do. And obviously someone could have done that with a tractor, but we were just trying to prep for the vineyard team to try to make it a little bit easier. And just me dragging that bin to the end of the vineyard row, I felt like I couldn't even breathe. Like it was horrible. So it was a major concern. The blessing there was because, smoke taint is weird. I'm sure a lot of people will talk about it a lot more with a lot more confidence than I will. But it's pretty unpredictable. And a lot of people are like, okay, it's proximity to the fire, it's time, how long has the smoke been since it's been, burning for the whatever compounds there to affect or not to affect. It's, absorbed in the waxy layer on the skin. And so we want to do all the things we can to minimize it, right? So we did no oak that year. We did really light pressings. We didn't do any fermentation, whole cluster fermentations. I love whole cluster. I like that whole thing. So it was a little bit of like the whole vintage was tempered for us, right? Like not only was the experience different, but the wine making process, we didn't have all the tools available to us that we normally would have. So it became less interesting to me. And also it was my second time doing it with the same place. So it was less interesting. Not to say that I didn't have a great time. I mean, not to say that I didn't value that experience, because having gone through a horrible disaster like that and watching folks figure out what to do and how to do it is massively important when you're trying to build your own project and preparing for your own disasters. It really is. But we made it through that vintage. James was lucky enough that his wines didn't really present smoke taint. We did taste every single day, and I tasted wines that were smoke tainted very clearly. I got to go taste with Lingua Franca, before they had to sell, and that vintage destroyed them. I have some really cute pictures of Austin in the little the winemaker's dog, just like sleeping on Austin's foot while we were tasting the one vat of Pinot that they made that year. And it was, you smell it and you're like, oh, this is interesting. It's not wine, but it could be something interesting, right? You could do something with this. It smelled like mezcal, like wine mezcal. And I was like, okay, there might be a marketing scheme that you can do, aromatized vermouth, like something. And then you taste it. And the experience of putting it on your palate was like sticking an entire cigar ashtray in your mouth and just letting it rip your tongue off. It was horrible. And James didn't get that. And there's a lot of people that will talk about, oh, well, it presents in the bottle 10 years later. Who knows? But all we could do is make the best wine that we could and cross our fingers and hope that, financially they were going to be able to bear it, to keep going. And they did, and those wines are still fine. Is it his best vintage ever? No, because he didn't have all the tools. We didn't get to experiment the way that he wanted to. But that is the cool thing about James, is that he's willing to experiment. So we tried different things, and even to this day, like I went and visited a few months ago now, and some of the processes that like I kind of maybe like planted a little seed on or like started, he's like full going now. But yeah, the vintage was challenging, but I'm glad we got through it. And I had friends who worked at other places, friends now that I have that I didn't know then, who worked at other wineries, and they were sent home a few weeks in. So I could have been, and I wasn't. So in that regard, I got really lucky.
2020.
Yeah.
Quite a year it was.
Yeah.
You still have this idea for this project. So tell me about taking the next steps toward that project becoming a reality.
Yeah. So now that I have my time frames not confused, I think 2020 was such a hard vintage, and it was such a hard experience coming off of such a high in 2019, like having that lightning bolt moment, realizing this is what I really want to do, and just feeling so surrounded by new knowledge in such a positive way. 2020 was like, okay, it was good for me to do it again. Obviously the vintage was horrible, and it kind of led me back to that like, okay, so like what am I doing this for? Like what is this for? Why? Because if I don't get to just have that experience of just, I'm here, I'm loving it, I'm not worrying about anything because I love what I'm doing so much, then I need to figure out what's next. And in that process, I wasn't living with Rick and Josie at the time, again, because they had moved to Bend, but I was still obviously very close with them. And in that, I think it was midway through this harvest that I was like, James, like, what do you think realistically about this harebrained scheme that we first teased ourselves about last year? And that's when we got in touch with Andy Gallagher. And that was kind of my way to rectify the 2020 vintage for me, because I needed something to come out of that experience feeling a win, because just working that harvest was not. It was just like COVID, doing this again, the same thing over again, smoke, like it was just one hit after another. And so Andy came out and did all these soil tests that we had talked about previously. And that was right at the end of that vintage. It wasn't at the end of the other vintage. And so that's what that was. And at that point, I remember planting the seed with my partner, having a phone conversation, being like, hey, look, like I have decided that this is what I want to do. I have decided that we're going to pay the, $3,000 to $4,000, whatever it costs to have Andy Gallagher come out and do that. And that to me, I'm a normal working person. Like it's not a just throw money away kind of experience. And fortunately, my business partners ended up paying that for their ranch. It's just like a knowledge, but I didn't know that at the time. We didn't have any agreements in place. We didn't have any background work. It was just like, we're doing this just to see what it's like. And we had that conversation, and I was like, if that happens, that means we're moving to Oregon. And that was never a guarantee. That was never a certainty. So that was a huge thing. And we've been together for 6 years now. Before we met, he had never moved outside of his family home. He had never traveled outside of Chicago except for one family vacation to Georgia. And it was a big deal. It was a big deal. But I came off of that vintage, having met Andy, having him out at the site. And, I was going in with certain expectations of that visit, being like, he might tell me that I'm crazy. He might say, hey, look, this is absolutely nuts. James warned me about that too, but he did none of those things. The visit that he had was incredibly encouraging. He thought it was very out there, right? Like not only physically, but it's a different kind of vineyard. It's a different kind of space. And the elevations are so extreme. And his main thing was the soils look fantastic. He was like, you're not going to have any problems with the soils. It's going to be the climate that you have problem with. And he was very unsure about that. But he also, that's not his wheelhouse. So he was very like, you're going to have to figure this out here. Go talk to Greg Jones. You know, he's the one to do climate modeling with you. You have to do some climate modeling before you figure this out. So then that became, look, the soils look good. And by that, I mean, like, we have a type of soil there called a Tyee sandstone formation, which is pretty unique to that southern part of the Oregon Coast Range. As a ancient marine sediment, sandstone, siltstone layered on top of each other. There's a small amount of volcanic mixed in, but it's a very small amount of basalt. But then because it's essentially been abandoned forest land for 100 years, the soils are incredibly deep and incredibly rich. They're also very acidic, and there's other imbalances that come from converting forestry to vineyard land. But he wasn't off-put by that. He did all of that. He was like, this is remediable, this is doable. And so I came off of that feeling very excited and very energized. And once again, and then it gave me that kind of feeling that I had in 2019. I was like, okay, we're doing this. And so going back to Chicago after that experience, it was like, I have a new goal. This is what my life goal is now. I want to move to Oregon. I want to plant a small vineyard. I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't know what the business arrangements are going to look like. I don't know if they're going to let me do it. And then that was it. So it became a lot of conversations with a lot of different people. And fortunately, that kind of like beginning planning stages, you don't actually need to be on site to do it. And so I spent probably the next year and a half in Chicago laying down logistical groundwork, talking to different people, talking to Bob and Rick and Josie, figuring out what that relationship would look like if they want to do it. And I just got so fortunate that they were 100% behind it and 100% behind wanting to explore it.
So as you were working out logistics for that and starting to plan it out, obviously you had small vineyard in mind. What did you have? Did you have wine production as well?
Yeah.
What was the sort of size and shape?
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal for me, and still to this day, is, you know, I want to be able to do what I did on my first harvest, right? Like I want to be, but more. I want to be involved in viticulture, obviously production, and, you know, as my journey went, I think my focus has become more on that part of it and less on the winemaking part. Going into that, at that point in time, my goal was to make wine. And my goal still is, pretty far away from that. But I knew that, you know, if I could find a reliable way to produce grapes, then I would always have the option later on to make wine. And it kind of felt like, you know, the philosophy that I really supported. And I never knock anybody who wasn't able to do this, because like no one gets to have their own vineyard as a unfinanced startup winemaker. It just doesn't happen. And I thought that was the route that I was going to have to go. You know, in 2019, in that interlude, I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to buy some fruit from somebody and, you know, source some equipment and just like throw things together. But I wanted to always be involved from the beginning to the end. Being able to farm the way that you want to farm leads to your wines being the way that you want them to be. It's very important to me that I do both, and I would never knock anybody who doesn't have access to that. I'm not saying those wines are any better or worse. I'm just saying for me personally, I was so lucky and so fortunate that was the position that I was put in. So it's always been about production. You know, it being so unknown, the site, whether or not it would work, we had to start really small, right? So the property is 600 acres. We kind of went into it being like, okay, first steps, let's do the soil set, right? Let's buy a weather station. So we bought a weather station, have had weather station out there collecting data. Let's work with Greg Jones. So we did some emails back and forth, and he kind of pointed me in the right direction to figure out like, what even is a climate modeling? You know, how do I even go about doing this research? So I did it. Figuring out the degree days of our site was really important. And the challenges that I had were, it was so remote and so out there that I didn't even have access to weather stations anywhere nearby. The only weather station that I eventually got access to is only a quasi-representation of my site, and it's the Oregon Department of Transportation has a weather monitor and traffic camera on Highway 20 in Blodgett. So I ended up emailing ODOT and asking them if there's any way I could get access to their data. And they sent me 10 years worth of data from that site. And so that was kind of, I used that. And then there was one like super, super remote forestry site on the other side, like 100 miles away. So again, not super representative, but those are the best things that I had to go with. So it was very, very unknown in terms of the climate. And that was the largest hurdle at that point, was how do we prove climate? And then my weather station I bought it from a company, installed it, and they promised me that the way that it would work is if I could get cell signal somewhere on their property, I put the transponder there, and then they're wireless relays, so then I could put the sensor column somewhere else. And they promised me that if I could get a cell signal, all it needs is just enough to send a tiny little data burst. Well, they lied. Or they didn't realize how far out I was. So if you go up to the top of that mountain on Baldy, as we call it, on the property, you can make a phone call, you can send a text message, but it's so fringe that you have maybe about a 20-meter square section that you can get cell signal in. And so I put the transponder up there, it didn't work. Very fortunate that my business partner, Bob, is an electrical engineer who also has done like hardware with radio transponders and stuff. So he took the whole thing apart and put on an Aggie antenna, so a large cell antenna, like an external one, to the actual device. And we essentially were able to jerry-rig a way to make it work. And that's how everything that we've done in this project we've had to do. We've had to build our own solutions to everything. But once we got it there, we got climate data. And this morning I woke up to a text being like, you have a failure trip alarm. Like one of my sensors went dead this morning and I got to go out there today or tomorrow and figure out what's going on with it. But we did that. And then, then it became, okay, how big do I make this? What do I do? And the questions of that were always kind of balanced with, how much time am I going to have to do it? Because it's not going to be my full-time job. Because if it is, we have to put in significantly more money, significantly more infrastructure investment, and then the pressure is going to be much, much, much higher. And we're just not proven enough yet to take that leap. So we want to do a small test plot that I can manage by myself with almost no infrastructure and almost no equipment, just to see if it's even possible. And then we'll go from there. So we decided on a 1.2 acre plot, and it's 28 rows, 200 feet long, and it is out in the middle of nowhere. It's about 620 feet elevation, and on this very gentle south-facing incline. It's very, very low. And the reason that we chose where we did was because I didn't have to clear any stumps from the logging process. The vast majority of this land, if you know what clear cuts in Oregon look like, they're these like mangled collection of stumps on hills. And that's what 80% of our land looks like. And that's a huge challenge, right? Because it involves having people come with heavy equipment, driving a wedge, splitting the log, craning it up, and then very gently moving topsoil, because you can't just scrape topsoil away. Yeah, so we decided on this 1.2 acre plot. It was a natural wildflower meadow, pretty much. We have open grazing on the property. There's a tenant at the very front who has a few head of cattle. It's nothing crazy. And during the winter, they let them free graze. So the first time I saw it was this like pretty empty plain. Obviously, the grass was very clear and manicured because of the cows, which you don't think about. And it was just kind of like, okay, this is perfect. And when Andy saw that site specifically, he said, that's going to be a challenge over there. We have several areas. The one that he was specifically talking about, I call the upper benches. It's what I'm most excited to plant eventually, but they're these beautiful, like 3 rolling, perfectly southwest facing hills at about 30% incline. But they're covered in tree stumps, right? And so it's a huge challenge. Andy was like, those look great, but that's going to be hard. This looks like a perfect spot for a small vineyard. So that's where we went. Yeah, that's where we went first.
What did you plant?
So we ended up planting, because it was a test plot, a few things before that. I get like that in between period of planning was also like, okay, who can I get to help me? How do I figure out what to do or how to choose what to plant? Because I knew what I liked. I wanted to plant something that I was passionate about, what I liked. But so Riesling was definitely on there, right? Pinot Noir was like, okay, I got to plant Pinot Noir because it's Oregon and I need validity as a growing site that's never been validated before. And so that's my path to validity. So I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to start there. I'm going to figure out what I can do. And I had Harry Peterson Nedry come out to my site. So he drove all the way from Portland in this tiny little Audi that was like super low riding. And he pulls up on this gravel road, and he's like, oh, should we drive up to the Vineyard? And he was going to take his little car. And we got in the mule, and it was very kind of him. Like, he had never met me before. I'd never met him. I just cold emailed him a little bit of my project and was like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm doing. I was encouraged by James to reach out to you because you are the father of Riesling in Oregon, and I want to pick your brain because I am a Riesling hound. And he was like, I want to see it. And so he came. I have some really fun pictures I'll give you guys of Harry with this like hat. It's misting, and he's just like zooming all over my land with his camera. But he was incredibly encouraging. If of anything, I was warned by several people that he tells you how it is. And I appreciate that, but he never gave me any bit of negative feedback. He was just excited. And so that encouraged me. And so I was like, boom, Riesling, picked his brain. His advice to me was like, you can't really do a test plot if it's that small. Like 1 acre is tiny, right? I mean, it's big to us when we're talking about property values, but in terms of acreage of vines, it's not big. And in hindsight, I kind of wish I had listened to him a little bit more, but I didn't. I was like, I hear you, but I'm going to do my thing. And so I decided to go a different route where I planted 4 different varietals. I planted Pinot Noir, I planted Riesling, I planted Chardonnay. And the reason I planted Chardonnay, even though I love white Burgundy, like that is obviously a style that is fantastic. I think Oregon Chardonnay is coming into its own in a way, but I'm not super like, I love it, right? It's not something that drives my passion. However, I love sparkling wines. Sparkling wines are where it's at for me. And so my site, with everyone kind of telling me, the risk of your place is that the climate is too cold. It's not going to be, well, I was like, well, you know what? Like, I have this weather data. I've tried to do some climate modeling. I'm not very good at it. I've gotten like generalized ideas. It's not that much colder. So if anything, it's going to be a great space to plant sparkling wine. So that was kind of my hedge. Whereas even if it's too cold to ripen this Pinot to the level that the market would demand me to here, I can make sparkling wine. And Riesling as well, right? Like Riesling, cold climate, high acid white varietal, does not need the temperature that you'd need here in the valley to ripen. Also, you can make sparkling wine out of it. Not that I will. But, and then my passion one was Chenin Blanc. I planted Chenin as well. And that is because I've always loved Chenin from the Loire Valley. I think it is a style that is pretty unfamiliar to most here still, even though in like the, nerdy wine world, it's really popular and people love it in the market or in Oregon in general. People think of Chenin Blanc as a California kind of bulk wine, and that's kind of the history of it. Before Cabernet was planted in Napa, most of those vines are Chenin Blanc. And they were grown in climates that just weren't really supportive of them being quality. But there's not a lot of it grown in Oregon. And so I kind of was like, I'm going to take that. I remember driving up to Walla Walla with, when I was working with James in 2020 and 2019, because he had a partnership with Leonetti. And so I would drive up to Walla Walla both years and like hang out with Chris Figgins for a few days, and that was fantastic. He gave me his Jeep one year, and I just like rolled around in Chris Figgins' personal Jeep and like explored Walla Walla for a few days. I remember going to a wine store there, and they had a bottle of Domaine Huet. It was an off-dry, and I think it was from like 2002, sorry. So 20 years old at that point, off-dry Chenin Blanc. And I bought it, it was like $80, right? I bought it, brought it back for one of our wine like things at the winery. And James, huge fiend of off-dry Riesling, like amazing quality wines. We tasted that, and it was the wine of the vintage. like, it was by far the best wine we'd all tried during our experiences there. And I was like, see? And James did not know that producer at the time. It was a wine or a style that he wasn't even really that familiar with. And it was kind of a moment for him. It was like, oh shit, this is good. Like, we could do this here. And you see a lot of people like Mimi Castillo, Bethel Heights, like those, like they have Chenin Blanc going. They had Chenin Blanc going really early on. And that kind of also led me into working with Mimi. So, you know, I love Chenin Blanc. We had this kind of connection. And then James was like, hey, you should also just reach out to Mimi, Mimi Castile. And so at the beginning of this process, I did. And I was looking for a vineyard consultant. And I was looking for somebody who would work with me within my means, because I am just kind of scraping this shit together, not really like financed or whatever. I proposed I just had a call with her. I talked to her about what the project was, what my vision for it was. And she was really excited because our philosophies are super similar. Whereas I want, the whole point of me doing this on this property is we're going to present something for this land that will make the land more ecologically sustainable, hopefully, than clear-cutting forestry, right? And that involves having a different economic model for the land as well, where if we can provide an economic stable resource to people in this valley, then it might be able to change the way that we view nature there. Instead of becoming monocropped forestry land, it could become multi-use land that's managed more as long-term forestry, and then also as sustainable viticulture as we can. So that was kind of the goal. That was my pitch to the family, and that was why they really liked it, because they want something that's also more, for lack of a better word, sexy for the next generation, right? Because their next generation had no interest in some old, decrepit timber land. But if all of a sudden that becomes vineyard land, that is also heavily emphasized on sustainable forestry, then it becomes more of a thing. So I talked to her about that. I also wanted to do a no-till philosophy, and that's been a huge part of my process. Is I didn't till that native meadow at all. I never tilled, not a single time. And sending Mimi the soil samples or the soil labs, you can see kind of like the health and the biodiversity of my site is kind of where a lot of the people who reach out to Mimi are wanting to start the journey of regenerative farming want their site to eventually be. Obviously we have, it was a clear cut. There are a lot of invasives. There are a lot of non-natives that come up. But when she went out and saw the site, she was like, I'm actually really surprised at how little there is of the invasives. Because in a clear cut like that, you'd expect a lot more of the plants that thrive on disrupted land to be present. And well, they were there for sure. And there's still all kinds of invasives everywhere, right? But there's still so much native growth there because we're surrounded by state forest on all three sides. We're so far in the middle of nowhere that it is kind of an opportunity that she was willing to help me out with. And so she's my vineyard consultant for the project. And she has worked with me I don't need a lot of support from her, but when I've had my freakouts or challenges that we've had through this project, it's always been like, I'm going to jump on the call with Mimi. She's going to point me in the right direction and I'm going to go. And that's kind of the level of consulting that has been fantastic. She helped me design what we planted. So we planted those 4 varietals. And she was super on board with the climate modeling and the idea of that those are tailored for this site appropriately. She helped me figure out how to lay out a vineyard, all of these things I'd never done. I ended up taking Patty's course at the Intro to Vineyard Management online while I was in Chicago, so I could get a basics of how to even do this. But we ended up going with 4 varietals, 3 clones of each varietal on a combination of 4 different rootstocks. So I did the exact opposite that Harry Peterson Nedry told me to do. But the idea was, I wanted to do this because I wasn't going to till. I did not, the soil reports that Andy Gallagher gave us recommended, heavy lime over 2 years because our soils were so acidic. I'm at a 5.0 pH with super deep subsoils, and some areas getting down to a 4.9, which is really acidic. But I didn't want to do that. The philosophy for me was that if I can leave this amount of biomass happy, hopefully the relationships and the microbial activity will kind of facilitate nutrients in a way that will counteract some of the negative effects of the acidity. And I will say that has worked to an extent. I mean, I think I was a little naive going into the process about being like, oh yeah, it'll be fine and everything's going to be great and there are going to be no challenges. But I stand by it, and it's been fantastic. So we did that, and so each varietal, like the Pinot Noir is on 2 different rootstocks, right? The Chenin Blanc is on 2 different rootstocks, and that way I can kind of track like what did well in these type of soils, what did well being thrown into this type of environment that is pretty acidic, that has a lot of aggressive competition, and what struggled. And we've learned a lot.
So tell us about what you've learned and about what comes next.
So right now I am just trying to let things grow. In terms of what I've learned, when Harry first came out to my site, one of the things he said was, get a water tank. Just get a water tank. And that became the theme of my first 2 years, because I'm dry farming. That's always been something that's been very important to me. Being in the SOM world, you're exposed to all of these different groups that are very passionate about certain philosophies. And you become really on board with that, right? Like, oh, that's amazing. Like, they're doing it better than they're doing it because they do this and they say this, and like those wines are better because, and then you start doing it and you're like, all of that is bullshit. It's all bullshit. Not that I don't support those philosophies, but as somebody who's trying to grow, you're like, I need to make decisions that are just going to let things be okay. So specifically, I'm talking about the deep roots, right? Like I wanted to be, and I still want to be a part of that group, and I haven't reached out to them, so I will eventually hopefully be. But I knew a bunch of them. James is one of them. I had coffee with 2 or 3 other folks who are really a part of that organization, and kind of talked about water needs for my first few years, right? Andy Gallagher and a lot of other people were like, this is a great place to dry farm. It's the Coast Range of Oregon. There's a lot of water. We're not really concerned in the long run whether or not these vines are going to be able to water. But then people are like, okay, well, what does watering till establishment look like? And my answer to that from folks who are established winery or viticulturalists, say hand water in the first year. So I went into that, and that was my pitch to my business partners and to myself, being like, I'm just going to hand water in the first year. It's going to be fine, right? Well, what does that mean for normal people growing grapes? That means they have a tractor with a water tank and boons, and they can easily refill it like that. We have a tractor, but my business partner is let's just say he doesn't like other people to use his toys. And so the use of the tractor is selective, at least for the moment, because it's not mine. I don't own the land. I don't own the equipment. And so for me, that was, I get a water tank, fill up the water tank, and then I had about 900 to 1,000 feet of literal garden hoses, and I used a garden hose and hand watered every single one of my vines with gravity. I was like, hand watering, right? Like, it's great. It was the spring, like I was super naively excited. Everything was great. Things just blew up and grew. We had no issue that year, 2020. There was a big scare in the Willamette Valley for frost. And what we kind of just were hoping was that our proximity to the ocean would kind of moderate the temperature a little bit, so we would have a little less danger of that. We had no frost damage, no even remote concern for frost. So I was like, great, perfect. Go into it, spring, growth, great. And then everything gets dry. I got hit by a drunk driver in my car, and so I was like dealing with all of that for a little while. And I go back, because I don't live there. It's a 2-hour commute for me one way to get to the vineyard. So I go back maybe like a week later, and it's just like dry. And it was a sudden shift for me. This is the first year that I've been living on the site where I can actually see the patterns of the land. And so it was a huge learning experience. I got water, worked with these great folks who would bring water in for me. But essentially what I had to do was, I was watering every row by hand. I would do a grid pattern. So there were like 9 plants in between at this point I didn't have any trellising up. They were just sticks in a field with a bunch of weeds because it wasn't even tilled, right? So you're talking like chest high weeds. The rows where the plants are planted, those are manicured a little bit more just to make sure that the plants aren't shaded out. But I take people out there and just like, what the hell are you doing? This looks like a disaster. I would water them by hand, and then by the time I would be able to get to the end of the vineyard, I would have to start over. Because it would take me about 3 days of manually doing this to finish the whole vineyard site. And meanwhile, I'm working a full-time job somewhere else. And so I would have to work there in the mornings, and then by like 3, I'd drive back to Portland, and by 5, I'd start my restaurant job here. I'd work a night shift restaurant job, and then I'd drive back to the vineyard to continue watering. And so it was a labor of love. And it was, going into this, we did a lot of like predictions, and everything on paper was super well laid out. That's how it goes. I was trying to be as prepared as I could. I talked to so many different growers and was like, okay, I need rough estimates of how many hours it's going to take me to farm 1 acre. And the estimates that I got averaged out at about 35 to 40 hours. And I put more hours driving in than that. Like that estimate probably got used up in the first 2 weeks of my summer. And so it was very quickly like, oh, this is real, right? This is not a simple project. This is not like, oh, you just put vines in the ground and don't till them and it's going to be great because the farming philosophies are better, right? It was not how it was. And it's not like, oh, you just hand water them and then they're good and then they'll be fine. A lot of plants struggled. We had a mortality rate that's pretty off the charts for conventional farmers, but I knew that was going to be the case no matter what I did going into it. I was prepared for that because this is a trial. I mean, it always has been. And I decided on top of making it a trial for the site and a trial for the climate, I decided to make it a trial for a no-till establishing vineyard, which, even Mimi Castile has said that, she tried that with rootstocks once, but it's not something that people do. But I was really passionate about it for a lot of different reasons that I could go into if you're interested. But it's very important to me that works that way. And it's only this unique part of it that will realistically ever be able to be that. Because when we do expand, which is part of the plan, we're going to have to rip out all those trees. And so there's going to be groundwork that needs to be done. And when we're doing that, why would we not just take the opportunity to amend the soils a little bit, right? It's just this one little very special place for me that I wanted to do and just preserve it the way that I did. And I paid the price for that in terms of finances, but also in terms of labor. But I don't regret any of it because it's been such a learning experience. So that was the first year. It was all hand watering, barely squeaked it out, honestly. Like, looking back now, now we're on our 3rd year, I don't know how any of them survived. I don't. We got so lucky because, yeah, I know,
They're resilient, but yeah.
Not that resilient. No, but seriously, this is what you get, like just coming into this and trying to make it work and not having gone to school. And I'm glad that I did it that way. Like I did a course, right? And I knew that I was going to be farming in a non-traditional way. But if I had gone to UC Davis, like in hindsight, just like 40 minutes away from my home and done an enology program or done a viticultural program, I would have thought I was insane and never would have done this. And I never would have taken the opportunity to even start this because I would have looked at the land and said, nah, it's not worth it. So, things happen mysteriously like that, but I'm happy that it did. But we made it through that first growing season pretty okay. I was very optimistic by the end of it because the rains came in the end, right? They always do, and that was such a blessing when I made it through and the rains came. Obviously, there's no fruit, right? They're little baby sticks, but we probably had 20% mortality rate, maybe higher, maybe 25% mortality rate through that first year, which 2% mortality rate is considered normal for most vineyards. But I didn't irrigate and I didn't till, and I was doing it literally by hand. Like I managed all the weeds with a weed whacker, like literally, and it's 1.2 acres. So we did that. And then the second year, we went into that, and in March of that next year, I had a bunch of friends come out, and similar to how we planted the vineyard in the first place, because we planted this vineyard literally by hand, digging a hole in the ground. And then what we would do is I worked with a worm farm in Newburgh, and so we brought some of the really high quality compost soil in, and we would mix that half and half with our native soil to kind of give the vines a bit of a pH buffer, because realistically shocking them with that low of a pH is just not a good idea, and that this way there'd be a little bit of a buffer so they could acclimate and then find their way to survival or not. And then we did a little bit of an augmentation with an organic bone meal as well, because phosphorus and calcium are very quickly absorbed in these type of acidic, like forestry soils. It's just yeah. So we were a little bit deficient in those, but we gave them what they needed. And the ones that survived. And the ones that didn't, I started working with my nurseries. I got very lucky working with a nursery in Northern California that kind of was willing to be crazy and make me these tiny little combinations of these different clones and rootstocks. I was talking my replacement orders are like, I need 20 vines of this combination. I need 7 vines of that combination. And most nurseries told me to absolutely go fuck off. That was probably the most challenging part of that process, because when I'd see a vine die, I knew that the chances of me being able to replace it were so low. Not because I couldn't do the work, I'm happy to do the work, but it's because it's how do I source that? And that's one of those logistical challenges where if I had went with the way that Harry told me to do it, I wouldn't have had that problem, but we're giving it a go. In March of that year, I had a bunch of friends come from Chicago, from California, rented an Airbnb in Philomath, and just had a bunch of friends out, and we installed the trellis. And that was a process. We worked with Vineyard Supply. They down just outside of Salem, and they've been so helpful to me through this process, because again, I had to learn every little bit of this myself. Before we even planted the vineyard, I had to learn how to build an elk fence, and I had to fence all 1.2 acres by hand. And I did that in the rain, and it was horrible, but learned how to do that, built the elk fence myself. Trellising, by this time, we totally skipped this. By this time, this was 2021, I think. So right before we planted, I actually ended up going to Germany, and I worked a harvest in Germany. And they had these really cool line posts that were kind of diamond shaped, where a lot of vineyards here don't, and they have little notches in them, so you just literally clip your wire right into the pole. You don't have to use any clips. There's no it's just boom, these diamond shaped poles. And I tried to source them, and Ken was able to find them at some place in steel manufacturer in Utah and bring them in for me on this tiny little scale. But I couldn't use wood. Wood end posts weren't an option for me, because if you use wood end posts, you have to have a machine to install them, right? And obviously we could have paid somebody to do it, but we're on such a small scale that it's not really economically viable for somebody to do that, let alone how rural we are. And so it's how do I make this work on my own? So we got all metal end posts, the 10-foot long end posts were a challenge, because you're okay, how do I install this by hand, right? You need a post pounder, and you need to install it in the ground. Well, they don't make a post pounder that's big enough for that. So I had to go to a custom steel fabrication place in Eugene and have them make me a custom post pounder so I could pound in these steel end posts by hand. And then, it was a wild process. We would stand on top of the mule. My friend Kelly, who does Olympic weightlifting, and she's a beast. She's a SOM from Chicago. She came and just wanted to do some labor for a week. She would start them. I would line them up. And I learned this in Germany, how to make them straight, because I did some trellising work when I was in Germany as well. And the people I worked for, it was just a 2-person team, father and son. They did everything by hand like I was doing. So I was okay, I'm not absolutely crazy. I see people doing this. Exactly. So she would start it, and then she'd switch off, I would do it, and then we would switch off twice, and then I would finish it with a sledgehammer until we got it to the mark. So everything was installed by hand. And we had 28 rows, 200 feet long, and then the middle post we were just pounded by hand. So the infrastructure has been quite intense. And then kind of fast forward a little bit into the second year, nobody knows what to expect with these vines. It's really an experiment. If I had tilled and if I had amended the soil, there would be no question. Like every consultant that I've worked with has been like, obviously this can work. So in my mind, I was like, well, I want to do it the way that I want to do it, just to see. I worry about that decision now a little bit sometimes, because it's like, why wouldn't I just conventionally farm it, give it 100% guarantee to work? That way I can expand and this project would be successful for me. So ask me again in 5 years whether I like the decision that I made. But right now I'm standing by what I did, because I think in the long run it's going to be so much more beneficial for that land and for learning the way to farm it low input, low economic input, and create a more interesting product. That's my goal. So going into the second season, spring happened. It was a fantastic spring. Like all the vines exploded. Obviously at this point there's a quilt work, so there's some that haven't been replanted yet because they were still getting regrafted for me. So I was already a year behind. It got dry really quick last year, really fast. We had a very short spring. Talking to all the deep roots people, all of the research that I had done, obviously Patty at OSU, her course is very much more conventional and very much more like real farming, where you water to establish for 5 years. That's pretty much the expected. You want to create an economically sustainable commercial product, here's what you do. And I was kind of like, okay, but here's this cool organization that only waters in the hand waters in the first year, right? And that's their thing. So that was I only had to hand water in the first year. I'm done. The whole summer was just absolute hell. I hand watered, but I did it for the first year and I'm done, and they're fine. And that was the philosophy that I was going into that year with. And it rocked my world to learn that I was wrong. It was not even remotely what I thought it was going to be. So I went out, actually had brought a friend that day, and I was expecting, because I'd go out, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, right? And it happened so fast. I think I hadn't been there for 4 days. And I go back there, and I was expecting to do more weed management, and there were no weeds to manage. Everything had dried instantly. And I was like, oh shit, I have to switch to water now, because I just saw the way that the vines were. And of course we have the weather data, and so you can calculate evapotranspiration rates with the data that I have. So that's kind of a, actual hard data that I can look at. I don't have a technical soil moisture sensor, but we're kind of able to kind of gauge it through that. So it was very clear that I was like, well, I guess my predictions for the whole spring were wrong. I need to water, because my vines are also very short still. Nutrients is only soluble to plants in water. You need water for them to have nutrients. And so they were presenting what looked like a nitrogen deficiency at the very beginning. So the basal leaves were going. They didn't have the level of growth that you would expect a second-year plant to have. So I definitely had a moment where it was a freak out, right? I'm doing this by myself. I'm doing as best I can, and it wasn't working. So I got on the phone with Mimi immediately as soon as I got into service, because the challenge of my site is that there's no cell service. So, and it's impossibly rural. So, 4 hours later, I get on the phone with Mimi when I'm back into town, and we had an hour conversation about it. Sent her all my photos, and she was just like, yeah, look, these are not. The vines, they're alive, they're fine, but they look like nursery plants. They don't look like second-year plants. And she's like, you knew that was going to happen because of the competition. You knew that was going to happen because of this no-till philosophy. That's not unexpected, but you have to get them water. That was the whole point. So that summer turned into the summer of water. And long story short, we could be here for another 3 hours, and I will not tell the story in full here. But long story short, I ended up frantically calling around the valley, talking to irrigation people, being like, okay, I got to install irrigation. I got to figure it out, right? But the problem is I have no electricity and I have no running water. So how do I do it? And I made a million phone calls. I ended up building a solar powered system. So right now we do have irrigation that's installed, and it's all running on solar power water pumping irrigation system. So I knew a little bit of electricity. My business partner was an electrical engineer, but instead of like winemaking or viticulture, that became my summer of an electrical internship. So I needed to figure out how to build control system, battery system, solar system, float switch, pump automation, everything, and I built it by hand. I was willing to pay somebody to do it. I wanted to pay somebody to do it, but no one would do it because it was too small, right? Like even if I had thrown 15 grand, 20 grand at somebody to just say, make this problem go away, there was no solution for it. So I was forced to build it myself, and it was a huge challenge. It was a huge challenge. And at the same time, so I was building the system, we had to source it, we had to, match specs, I had to figure out flow rates and where is the water coming from, and all of these problems had to be solved. At the same time, my vines are in the middle of one of our really, really hot summers, right? 2023, hot. And so I'm hand watering with a garden hose while I'm doing this, keeping them alive, just barely keeping them alive. I have friends from the Valley or here, wine industry friends, just regular friends who support this. And so they were just like, yeah, just like, I'll bring me down one day, I'll water, you do that. And that's how I got away with it. So we pulled it off. And by the end of July, the irrigation system was installed and functioning, where I can now push a button on my phone and it's all Bluetooth, and I can set zones and I know when irrigation is happening. I can figure out exactly how much water is getting to every plant. It's all able to be monitored remotely and solar powered, which is really cool. And obviously that's like a fun, environmental thing as well, but it wasn't designed because of that. It was designed because that's the only way we could do it. So last year was a water year, right? And I came out of that year being so excited because having the tail end, the like midsummer to tail end of that summer, all of those vines having the amount of water that they needed, the growth just exploded. And they were lush and green and so much healthier than they were that first year. That first year, it was like, I don't know how they survived. Whereas the end of that second year, they might not have been as nearly as big as what you'd expect a second year commercial, a traditionally farmed vineyard to look like, but they were amazing. So I was in high spirits when that fall happened. And of course, fall for a lot of winemakers is stressful, but for me, it's just like, I'm done. I get to go, play a video game or do something fun for myself.
So with all that,
yeah.
One more question for you. So you've talked a little bit about obviously what a long-term project is. This is a test to a vineyard, potentially, to a winemaking project, potentially.
Yeah.
Give me an idea of ultimate goal. Where do you see this in 5 years?
Yeah, of course. So now that we've kind of gone through a lot of those little challenges, right? It's
a little.
Well, yeah, and it's like this year we've also had challenges. Like this year for us has been the year of frost. So a lot of Willamette Valley vineyards dodged frost by the hair of, skin of their teeth this year. I got hit really hard. So now it's like, okay, here we go again. I can't catch a break. But all of these problems have created learning experiences for how are we going to expand? What is the next chapter of this? This year is frost. I might have to treat this more like a vineyard in Walla Walla, right? Like I have to really think about frost mitigation strategies. But the plan is, and water, like, okay, well, what is our long-term water goal, right? A lot of that gets really complicated with Oregon water rights. But, there's space for reservoirs. There's space for water storage. This property is so rich in possibilities. And in terms of frost, those are solvable problems. Those are problems that farmers have been dealing with forever. And so what we'd like to do is now, steps forward. How do I expand? I've been very fortunate that my business partners there's money to be had, that we've been able to do this, but I want to plant 70 acres. There is a 600 acre property. I want 70 of it at least to be vines. And that's what we've mapped out on Google Earth. And I've plotted most of the vineyard sites out already, about like where things would go and how much area would be and all of that. That's a lot. That's a lot of money. So when we get to the point where these vines are thriving, this 1.2 acre test plot is thriving, that's when I go to folks that I know from my days in Chicago, from my days in the wine sales industry who are following my journey already, who are investors who want to be in this project. I have a call later today with somebody who's just trying to follow up, being like, hey, when can I give you money? And I'm not at the place where I want to take anybody's finances yet, because I need to be crystal clear about how it's going to work. And all of the challenges that we've gone through have kind of showed me that I just have gotten so lucky being able to do this the way that I have. Because if I was beholden to a bank or beholden to an investor right now, I'd be done. I'd be done. So we're going slow, and this project is my lifelong project. It's not a 5-year project. So I don't know exactly where it's going to be in 5 years. The plan is right now I need to produce fruit. And once I produce fruit, then it's like, okay, then what, right? Because am I going to make the wine? Who am I going to sell the wine to? Where does that go? And those are all more of the sales questions that I've been thinking about. And I don't want to make the wine right away. Because if I were to do this vineyard, I mean, you heard my story about how I made the vineyard. It's very done by me. It's very home scratch, right? And I want it to be validated as a quality growing region in Oregon. I think there's something really special about this region, and for the future of this region, even Andy and Mimi and Harry Peters and Nedry and all of these people that I've worked with, were like, if this takes off, it's going to change things, because land is so cheap there. And we're struggling in the Willamette Valley creating wines that are delicate anymore. Look at how hot it gets all the time. And so it is a huge potential. But I would not be able to get validity if I tried to make this wine in a garage. It's just not realistic. And then I'd go and try to sell it, door to door? It's just not working. So my plan was always work with a professional, work with somebody who'd be willing to buy the fruit cheaply or whatever deal we'd work out, and just have them make it. And I had been talking to several people, and then I had James out last summer, and he and I ended up talking probably for 5 hours. He had a legal appointment he had to make, and he was late for that because we were just rolling around in the mule talking about the property, talking about my vision, talking about why the no-till is so important to me, and more of the farming philosophies that we haven't really gotten into here. And he was so on board that he was just like, look, if you would let me make the wine for you, that would be, and so essentially that's the plan. I would be I'd be honored if he'd made the wine. And he's offered now to buy all the fruit from me for the first few years, make the wine under the Trisatum label, which is my vineyard name on it. And then that way I can be validated as look, this is an actual vineyard, this is an actual growing region, and I can go to my investors then with a bottle, or my folks now with a bottle, and say, this is what I've done so far, and this is my expansion plan. Whether I expand all at once or not, there's kind of a threshold of making it economically viable to live off of. So I would need to go 10, 15 acres at once. But do we go 10 acres? Do we go 30 acres? I don't want to go 60 acres all at once. It's too much, especially with a site like this that it's just so many unknowns. But my long-term vision is having that. And then I would also like to do mixed crop. So I want to do orchards. There's a lot of north-facing slopes on this. I would there's a 80-year-old apple orchard on the property that still bears fruit. That's never been managed in its history. And it still bears fruit, which is insane. So I'd like to plant some apples. I'd like to plant currants, black currants. I'd like to do some small specialty crops for liqueurs, and then do a regenerative farming style. So eventually integrate livestock and do it that way. And that's kind of the long-term vision for this project. And also, of course, it's 600 acres, so most of that will always be managed as forestry. And creating a sustainable economic way to make that not a monocrop of forestry, but instead a more diverse and healthy ecosystem, so that we can be preserved for future generations.
That's amazing. And
Thanks.
That's a high. I love the vision for it.
Yeah, it's shoot big, right? And that's kind of the thing. It's a shooting big project.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you.
Okay.
Obviously, we could talk all day.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Appreciate the time and sharing your story. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that you wanted to cover here at the end?
No, I think that's it. I appreciate you. I was pretty surprised to get your message. I'm very honored to be included in this, even though I am kind of a scraping it by kind of homegrown kind of person. So.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your time, and watch out for the